The view from the 45th floor of my Chicago office is a sea of gray stone and freezing glass. I watch the final digital signature flicker on my monitor, effectively dismantling a corrupt, multi-million-dollar empire with a single keystroke. There is a cold power in being the predator instead of the prey. I am no longer the girl who trembled in the dark. I am Ms. Price, the woman who carves out the rot in the corporate world without blinking. The reflection in the window reminded me of the night that forged this armor. I was 15 years old when the world turned white and lethal. A blizzard howled through the desolate train station as my father, Bishop Solomon, and my mother, Loretta, forced me out of the car. The engine idled like a growling beast in the dark. My father reached into his pocket and tossed a $5 bill into the slush. He told me that it was a lesson in humility and that God did not accept prodigal children. My mother did not even look at me. She simply laughed and rolled up the tinted glass window as they drove away. The innocent Nia died in that snowbank, replaced by a girl with a heart of tempered steel. The silence of my office was broken by a secure notification. Big Mama Pearl had passed away. She was the only soul who ever truly saw me. She left me 40 acres of land in the South, a sacred stretch of soil that held the sweat and tears of our ancestors since the days of slavery. It was never just dirt, it was our history. However, my intelligence network revealed a betrayal that burned hotter than my grief. My parents had declared me legally dead years ago to seize control of that land. They were currently finalizing a deal to sell those 40 acres to a lithium mining conglomerate for $50 million. They were not just selling my inheritance, they were auctioning off the very soul of our lineage for a paycheck. Solomon and Loretta think they are burying a ghost, but they are about to realize that some ghosts come back to collect what is owed. I moved with a precision that was clinical and absolute. To execute this surgical strike, I recruited Terrence, a ruthless lawyer with a penchant for corporate warfare, to act as my personal assistant. We did not return to that dusty town as family. We arrived as a storm. I was no longer the discarded daughter. I was Ms. Price, the lead auditor, representing a massive shell corporation designed to swallow my parents whole. My arrival was a performance of high fashion and higher stakes, calculated to ensure that no one would recognize the ghost beneath the expensive silk. I walked into my father's plush pastoral office with an aura that commanded the very air in the room. Bishop Solomon rose from his leather chair with a smile that was slicker than oil. He did not see his child. He saw a gateway to $50 million. He bowed and scraped, offering me expensive coffee and empty flattery, while Terrence stood like a silent sentinel at my side. Every word out of Solomon's mouth was a testament to his greed. He spoke of the church and his legacy with a hollow piety that made my skin crawl. When I steered the conversation toward the 40 acres, I asked him about the history of the land and the woman who had tended it. Solomon let out a sharp and dismissive bark of laughter. He leaned forward and told me that those ancient roots and the parched soil of a senile old woman held no value beyond the rich minerals buried deep beneath the surface. He mocked the very ground that Big Mama Pearl had bled for. He called her legacy worthless. I kept my face as still as a frozen lake, masking the white-hot rage that threatened to shatter my composure. I told him that my firm required a comprehensive audit to verify the financial standing of both the church and his personal estate before the deal could proceed. I demanded full access to every ledger and bank statement under the guise of financial due diligence. Solomon did not hesitate for even 1 second. His eyes gleamed with a desperate hunger for the wealth he thought was coming. He agreed to hand over the keys to his kingdom, unaware that he was opening the door for the woman who would burn it all down. In the velvet darkness of my hotel suite, I stripped away the $100 silk and the persona of the corporate executioner. I scrubbed the expensive cosmetics from my skin until it was raw. I pulled on a pair of frayed and stained jeans and an oversized hoodie that smelled of artificial poverty. I smeared a streak of soot across my cheekbone and let my hair tangle into a wild and neglected mess. This was the transformation of a ghost. I needed to see the depths of their depravity from the dirt upward. I was no longer the high-powered auditor. I was Nia the failure, the daughter who had supposedly died in the shadows of the world, returning to beg for the crumbs of a family that had discarded her. I walked toward the towering mansion my parents had built on a foundation of tax-exempt donations and hollow prayers. The architecture was an arrogant display of wealth that screamed of stolen labor. I reached out and struck the heavy oak door with a trembling hand. When it swung open, Loretta stood there in a gown that cost more than most people earned in 1 year. She did not gasp with maternal relief. She did not offer an embrace. Instead, she stepped forward and delivered a stinging slap that snapped my head to the side. The blow was heavy and filled with a decade of resentment. She hissed at me, asking how I dared to show my face and embarrass her after all this time. She did not ask where I had been or if I had eaten. She grabbed my arm with fingers like talons and dragged me inside. Her only concern was the upcoming gala and the wealthy guests who would soon arrive. She was not welcoming a lost child. She was hiding a shameful secret. She shoved me toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen, where the help labored in silence. It was there in the narrow hallway that I collided with Deaconess Johnson. She was a woman of iron and grace who had been the closest friend of Big Mama Pearl. She stopped dead in her tracks, her hand flying to her chest as she looked into my face. She did not see the rags or the dirt. She looked straight into my eyes, searching for the fire of the lineage we shared. She leaned in close, her voice a fragile whisper, asking if it was truly Nia and if I was actually alive. Loretta did not miss a beat. She laughed a cold and jagged laugh, waving a hand dismissively as she tightened her grip on my shoulder. She told the deaconess that I was merely a new mute maid she had hired to help with the heavy cleaning for the event. She claimed I was a simple soul from the outskirts of town who could not speak a word. Deaconess Johnson remained silent, but her sharp eyes never left mine. She saw through the lies of the bishop's wife. In that quiet kitchen, a silent pact was formed. She was calculating the truth, and I knew the game had truly begun. The cold air in the storage shed bit into my skin, carrying the scent of dry hay and old forgotten memories. This was the place where I had played as a child, back when the world felt wide and full of promise. Now it was my cage. Loretta had locked me inside to keep the embarrassment of my existence hidden from the world. I sat on a rough wooden crate surrounded by shadows and rusted garden tools, but the glowing screen of my laptop painted my face in a sharp blue light. I had carefully positioned the device on a stack of straw, activating a high-end virtual background that depicted a sleek, minimalist executive office in downtown Chicago. To the men on the other side of the camera, I was the untouchable Ms. Price. The video call connected, and the faces of Bishop Solomon and his slippery associate Dante filled the screen. I adjusted my posture, letting the steel in my spine dictate my tone. I began the meeting by diving straight into the discrepancies I had found in the church ledgers. I looked Dante directly in the eye through the lens, questioning him about a massive budget deficit that seemed to vanish into his personal accounts. My voice was a blade of ice as I told him that I expected a full explanation for the missing $700,000 by the end of the business day. Just as Dante began to stutter an excuse, a violent thud shook the heavy wooden door behind me. Loretta was outside, screaming and pounding on the shed with a heavy broom handle. She yelled for me to get my lazy self out there and start scrubbing the marble floors of the main hall immediately. The sound was deafening in the small space. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. If she forced that door open, the illusion would shatter, and my entire operation would go up in flames. I moved with the frantic grace of a tightrope walker. I slammed the mute button on the screen and turned toward the door. I threw my voice into a high, weak pitch, shouting that I was coming right away and was just finishing the task she had given me earlier. The moment the words left my mouth, I whipped back to the laptop and unmuted the microphone. My expression shifted instantly from panic to professional disdain. I told Dante that I was still waiting for his answer and that my patience was not a renewable resource. Sweat rolled down my neck, soaking into my tattered hoodie, but I did not let my hand tremble. I was playing 2 roles in a deadly theater, and one wrong move would mean the end of everything. The dining room was a theater of grotesque opulence, where the air smelled of expensive lilies and deep-seated rot. Loretta had forced me into a threadbare servant uniform that was 3 sizes too small, a cruel costume designed to strip away any remaining shred of my dignity. I moved like a shadow around the mahogany table, serving the family and their elite guests. Earlier that afternoon, I had sent a formal email as Ms. Price, claiming a sudden corporate emergency prevented my attendance. It was a calculated move. I needed to be invisible tonight so I could plant the seeds of their destruction from within the very heart of their sanctuary. The primary source of my irritation was Monique, the woman Dante had married. She sat there draped in white silk, her eyes tracking my every move with a predatory gleam. She treated my presence like an offensive odor, barking orders for more water or more bread before I could even finish the current task. As I leaned over to place a platter of roasted lamb on the table, Monique shifted her foot and caught my ankle with the sharp heel of her shoe. I stumbled forward, my knees hitting the hard floor with a dull thud that sent a ripple of amusement through the gathered guests. Monique did not hide her sneer. She looked at me with a gaze that reduced my entire existence to garbage. She leaned back in her chair and remarked to the table that people of my low station possessed a scent of poverty that no amount of scrubbing could ever truly remove. She claimed that some souls were simply born to serve their betters. She gestured toward her glass with a flick of her wrist, commanding me to pour her another glass of the expensive red vintage. I stood up slowly, my face a mask of subservient apology, while my blood boiled with a cold and focused rage. I gripped the heavy crystal bottle and leaned over her pristine white designer dress. As I tilted the neck of the bottle, I allowed my hand to slip with choreographed precision. A dark and viscous stream of red wine erupted across the front of her gown, spreading like a massive bloodstain over the expensive fabric. Monique let out a shriek that pierced the room, jumping up as the cold liquid soaked through her layers of silk. Dante roared in fury and lunged across the chair, his hand raised as if to strike me down in front of everyone. Bishop Solomon intervened before the blow could land. He grabbed Dante by the arm, hissing that they could not afford a public scandal or a noise complaint while the neighbors and the press were watching the estate so closely. I bowed my head low, murmuring a string of frantic and hollow apologies while I backed away into the shadows. They did not notice that while I was on my knees earlier, I had successfully adhered a microscopic listening device to the underside of the heavy table. The trap was set. The garden air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the bitter stench of Dante's desperation. He dragged me into a dark corner beneath the weeping willow, his fingers digging into my arm like iron hooks. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and mounting panic. Dante told me that I was going to sneak into the master bedroom and steal the diamond necklace Monique had worn to dinner so he could pawn it immediately. He admitted that he owed a massive debt to a dangerous criminal organization and his time had run out. When I hesitated, he snarled a threat into my ear, promising to call the police and report me as a homeless trespasser who had broken into the estate. He believed he held all the cards, but he was merely a small man, drowning in a sea of his own making. I retreated to the shadows and activated the remote link to the listening device I had planted under the dining table. Combining the audio from the house with the financial discrepancies I had uncovered as Ms. Price, I felt the final piece of their depravity click into place. The horror was far worse than simple corporate greed. The Good Shepherd Fund, a charity supposedly dedicated to paying for life-saving surgeries, had been completely drained. The money was intended for a 6-year-old orphan named Marcus, a child under the protection of Deaconess Johnson, who was currently in critical condition. Dante had systematically pillaged the account to fund his gambling addiction, losing thousands of dollars at underground tables. Even more sickening was the discovery that Bishop Solomon had personally signed the fraudulent documents to cover up the theft for his son. They were not just stealing from the church, they were stealing the very heartbeats of the most vulnerable. Marcus was dying in a hospital bed because my father preferred to protect a criminal son rather than save an innocent life. The cold calculation of my revenge transformed into something much more powerful and dangerous. This was no longer a private grudge or a quest to reclaim my stolen land. This had become a war for justice against monsters who wore the robes of the righteous. I stood in the dark watching the lights of the mansion flicker like dying stars. I made a silent and unbreakable vow to my ancestors and to that little boy. I would not stop until I had clawed back every single cent they had stolen. I would ensure that Solomon and Dante paid for their sins with interest that would bankrupt their very souls. The shadows inside the storage shed felt like a heavy shroud as Loretta shoved me through the door and turned the iron bolt. The wine incident had stripped away her thin veneer of Christian patience. She returned an hour later, carrying a cracked ceramic plate piled with cold scraps of gristle and hardened crusts that looked like food meant for a stray animal. She dropped the plate into the straw at my feet, her lip curling in a gesture of absolute disgust. I sat there in the dark, my eyes cast downward, playing the part of the broken child one last time. I looked up at her, my voice trembling with a rehearsed fragility as I asked her why she hated me so much. I brought up the night at the train station, whispering about the cold and the way the snow felt like needles against my 15-year-old skin. I asked if she ever regretted leaving her only daughter to die in the dark. Loretta let out a sharp and jagged laugh that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. She stepped closer, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. She leaned down, her eyes flashing with a cruel triumph as she spoke her truth. She told me that the night they abandoned me at that desolate station was the most relieved she had ever felt in her entire life. She described me as a heavy debt and a burden that had stood in the way of her social climbing. She claimed that my existence was an obstacle to her becoming the perfect wife of a powerful bishop. Her only regret, she hissed, was that she had not gotten rid of me years earlier. She spoke of her own child, as if I were a stain she had finally managed to scrub from her expensive white rugs. Loretta did not notice the tiny glinting dot embedded in the top button of my tattered hoodie. She was too busy savoring her own cruelty to realize that a high-definition pinhole camera was capturing every syllable of her confession. It recorded the way her mouth twisted when she called me a mistake, and the way she laughed at my perceived misery. She thought she was speaking to a victim who had no voice left to scream. She had no idea that she was testifying at her own trial. I watched her walk away, my heart as cold as the floor beneath me, knowing that her words were the final nail in the coffin of the Solomon dynasty. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the church executive office, casting long and sharp shadows across the polished oak table. I arrived exactly at 9 o'clock, shedding the rags of the previous night for a charcoal gray suit that radiated authority and cold precision. Terrence walked behind me, carrying a leather briefcase that held the instruments of their destruction. Bishop Solomon and Dante were already waiting, their faces flushed with the fever of impending wealth. They saw a payday of $50 million. I saw a courtroom and a cell. I opened the heavy folder and spread the closing documents across the table. I looked at Solomon and stated that for the transfer of the 40 acres to be legally binding, the signature of the primary heir was required. I watched their eyes dart toward each other for a fleeting second. Without missing a beat, Dante produced a transfer deed that already bore a forged signature in the name of Nia King. He claimed that the girl had left everything to the church before her tragic and untimely passing. I leaned forward, my voice as smooth as polished marble, and noted that for a transaction of this magnitude, the signature must be witnessed and executed in the presence of the corporate notary. Dante let out a confident and arrogant chuckle as he reached for the expensive fountain pen. He did not hesitate for even one heartbeat. He looked me directly in the face and signed the name of his dead sister with a flourish that was insulting in its ease. He leaned back in his chair and joked that the girl had likely died in a gutter somewhere years ago, so no one would ever be the wiser. Solomon nodded in agreement, adding that it was a blessing to turn such a tragic memory into a prosperous future for the ministry. Their lack of remorse was a physical weight in the room. I reached into my bag and pulled out the heavy metal notary seal. I pressed it down onto the document with a sharp and echoing thud, leaving a permanent indentation in the paper. I looked at the forged signature and then up at the two men who had betrayed their own blood for silver. I told them that the paperwork was now officially complete. I felt a surge of grim satisfaction as I tucked the original document into my folder. They had just committed a federal felony of fraud and forgery in front of a licensed officer of the court. The trap had snapped shut, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt the light of true justice beginning to burn through the darkness. The grand ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and hypocrisy as the church celebrated its 30th anniversary gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm and deceptive glow over the wealthy donors who sipped champagne. Bishop Solomon stood behind a gilded pulpit, his voice booming with a rehearsed warmth as he lectured the crowd on the virtues of Christian charity and the necessity of loving the unlovable. I was forced to stand in a shadowed corner of the stage, dressed in the filthy rags and soot of my homeless persona. They had planned to use me as a living prop, a pathetic beggar they had supposedly rescued from the streets to demonstrate their immense compassion to the world. Bishop Solomon beamed at the cameras and announced that it was time to welcome their most prestigious guest, the brilliant Ms. Price, to present a massive ceremonial check for the lithium land deal. The crowd erupted in polite applause as the spotlight scanned the room for the elusive corporate auditor. Instead of a woman walking in through the grand entrance, I stepped forward from the shadows of the stage. A collective gasp rippled through the front row. Loretta looked at me with a mixture of confusion and growing horror, her face turning a pale and sickly shade of gray. I did not stop at the edge of the stage. I reached up and gripped the collar of my tattered hoodie, ripping the thin and dirty fabric down the middle with a sharp and violent motion. The tattered rags fell to the floor like the skin of a shed snake. Beneath the filth was a blindingly white and impeccably tailored power suit that shimmered under the stage lights. I stepped up to the microphone, my heels clicking against the wood with the sound of a ticking clock. The entire hall fell into a silence so profound that I could hear my father's ragged breathing. I adjusted the microphone and looked directly into the eyes of the man who had thrown me away 15 years ago and the woman who had laughed as he did it. My voice was steady and carried the weight of 1,000 storms. I spoke into the silence, telling the bishop and my mother that their daughter had finally come home. The masks were gone, the stage was set, and the girl they had tried to bury was now the woman who would dismantle their world. The massive digital screen behind the pulpit flickered to life, but it did not display the celebratory slideshow of 30 years of ministry. Instead, the high-definition speakers roared with the sound of Loretta's cruel laughter. The entire ballroom watched in a frozen state of shock as the video played, showing her twisted face as she confessed to abandoning me at the station. The footage transitioned seamlessly to the hidden camera in the garden, capturing Dante as he admitted to pillaging the heart surgery fund of 6-year-old Marcus and plotting to steal his own wife's jewelry. Finally, the audio of Bishop Solomon mocking the sacred legacy of our ancestors and Big Mama Pearl filled the hall like a toxic cloud. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The crowd of donors and parishioners erupted into a frenzy of righteous indignation. Monique let out a piercing scream of betrayal as she watched her husband plan to rob her blind. Bishop Solomon, his face a frantic shade of crimson, lunged toward the edge of the stage and screamed for the security guards to seize me and drag me into the street. He tried to claim the video was a digital fabrication, but his voice was drowned out by a sharp and rhythmic thud. Deaconess Johnson stood up at the center table, her heavy wooden cane striking the marble floor with the force of a judge's gavel. She pointed the tip of her cane directly at the bishop, her voice ringing out with a celestial authority that silenced every soul in the room. She commanded them to let me speak, declaring to the heavens that I was the granddaughter of Pearl and the true blood of the 40 acres. Her endorsement was a signal. Within seconds, the entire women's auxiliary and the elders of the church stood up in a solid wall of support behind me. The heavy double doors at the back of the hall burst open as a dozen federal agents and local police officers flooded the room. I had provided the forged documents and the recorded confessions to the authorities an hour before the gala began. The glamorous stage became a crime scene. The crowd watched in silence as the golden boy Dante and the holy Bishop Solomon were forced onto their knees. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the sound system as the Solomon dynasty was led away in chains. The fluorescent lights of the prison visiting room flickered with a clinical and unforgiving brightness. I sat behind the reinforced glass watching as Solomon and Loretta were led out in coarse orange jumpsuits. The arrogance that had once defined them had evaporated, replaced by a desperate and hollow franticness. They pressed their palms against the glass, weeping and begging me to use my vast resources to post their bail. Solomon pleaded in the name of the very God he had betrayed, while Loretta promised she would be a real mother if I only gave her one more chance. They did not love me. They only loved the freedom that my money could buy. I remained silent until their voices cracked from exhaustion. I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out a worn, wrinkled $5 bill that I had kept for 15 long years. I slid the bill into the small metal slot at the base of the partition. I told my father that this was the startup capital I was gifting them for their new life. I looked him in the eye and repeated the words that had haunted my nightmares. I told him to study it well and to finally learn the lesson about humility that he had once forced upon a terrified child in the snow. The irony was a cold weight in the room as I stood up and walked away, leaving them to the silence of their cells. A week later, I stood on the edge of the 40 acres of land that Big Mama Pearl had protected with her life. The air was warm and smelled of wild grass and red clay. I did not sign the contract with the mining corporation. Instead, I sat at a small wooden table with Terrence and Deaconess Johnson to sign a deed of gift. I officially donated the entire property to establish the Pearl and Johnson Community Center. This would be a sanctuary for orphans and a specialized medical facility for children like Marcus, ensuring that no child would ever be left behind due to the greed of men. Deaconess Johnson stood beside me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder as she watched the surveyors begin their work. She smiled with a profound and quiet satisfaction. I realized then that my journey was complete. I had not merely executed a cold and calculated revenge. I had reached back through time to heal the wounds of my ancestors and revive the honor of our family name. The soil beneath my feet felt solid and alive, no longer a commodity to be sold, but a legacy that would bloom for generations to come. Zora's journey teaches us that your bloodline doesn't define your destiny, but your character does. We often fear that cutting off toxic family members means losing a part of ourselves. But sometimes, pruning the dead branches is the only way for the tree to flourish. True power isn't about wealth or status. It's about the resilience to rebuild yourself when the world breaks you down. Never let anyone treat you like a discount when you know you are priceless. God may not come when you want him, but he is always right on time with justice.